unfortunately don't have very many scientists this time, but we do have some very good communicators who are very good at communicating the science that our scientists and researchers have found out, and also a doctor and a researcher in veterinary science. So we have Dr. Emma Naluyima with us today, and I'm going to show a very short video introducing her.
Dr. Emma Naluyima is a smallholder farmer and private veterinarian in Uganda. Though her holdings may classify her as a smallholder farmer, there is nothing small about the returns she has shown can be gotten from agriculture.
Next, we have George Monbiot, who is a British writer known for his environmental and political activism, and an investigative journalist who is a science communicator on agriculture and the climate crisis.
We also have Mark Lynas here today, and he is a British author and a journalist, and is also an environmental activist who focuses on the climate change.
Now George will give a short talk before the other two guests.
So I just want very briefly to introduce the subject and explain why I wanted this to be the theme of the Fridays for Future talk this week. Food and farming obviously are absolutely central to our survival and our prosperity, but the impacts of climate breakdown on them and the impacts of them on climate breakdown, I feel, have been greatly neglected in a lot of our public discussions and are massively neglected in the mainstream media. And there's two real components to this. Firstly, that the way we currently produce our food is the greatest cause of ecological destruction and the loss of wildlife abundance and diversity on Earth today. It's also a major contributor to climate breakdown. But secondly, climate breakdown threatens the very basis of our subsistence by threatening, as Mark will explain, to throw us into structural famine. And it's really extraordinary to me that this issue that's like hundreds of times bigger than coronavirus just hasn't been receiving the attention it deserves. We've seen people fighting over toilet paper in the shops recently, and it's an ugly sight. But unless we pull out of the death spiral we're in very quickly indeed, we're going to see people fighting over food, certainly within the lifetimes of Kay and Isabel. I don't know about the rest of us, but this is the real prospect which we now face. And that's going to be a heck of a lot uglier than people fighting over toilet paper, unpleasant as that may be. And so what I want us to do in this webinar is really to focus people's minds on the threats that we face and some of the means by which we can try to avoid those threats. And in doing so, some of it's going to be pretty controversial. Some of the ways in which...
Hi, sorry to interrupt, George. Something's gone wrong with the stream and we're not live at the moment. So Anika is just trying to fix it for us.
Okay.
But,
yeah, it says it's stopped for copyright reasons, which I have no idea why.
That would be the video.
Really? What, showing the YouTube video?
Just depends who holds the copyright for that video, I guess.
I really wouldn't think that would be a problem because, yeah, it's just, anyway.
Right. Sorry about this.
So what, is everyone seeing a blank screen now?
No, it's just ended. It's gone away. We should be able to. Okay, we're up again on YouTube again. So sorry about that. Everyone, thanks for waiting if you're watching right now. Apologies, we had some technical issues. And we were right in the middle of George's talk. So George, would you like to start from the beginning again?
Thanks, Kate. Shall I start from the beginning of the talk, okay? Yeah, sure. Okay, so very briefly, the reason I wanted us to discuss this crucial topic is that it's been massively neglected, that there are two components here, that food and farming are major drivers of ecological and environmental destruction in their current form. In fact, food production is the key reason for ecological habitat destruction and the destruction of wildlife diversity and abundance. It's also a major driver of climate breakdown. But also, climate breakdown is going to be a major driver of the destruction of our capacity to feed ourselves. In fact, there are some genuine alarming and disturbing projections, which Mark will talk about how it could throw us within not too many years into potential structural famine. We've seen people recently in the shops fighting over toilet paper. That is an ugly sight. I really hope we're not going to see people within the lifetimes of Isabel and Kay here fighting over food, but it's a real prospect unless we pull ourselves out of this death spiral. We're discussing this far too little in politics, in the media, in public life in general. We urgently need to talk about where the food is going to come from, how we're going to produce it. And in doing so, I think we need to be pretty open-minded. We need to look at things which might be quite controversial at this stage, and I'll be talking about some of those possibilities. But the urgent task we have now is to ensure that we set up a system of food production that will feed the world without devouring the planet.
Thank you so much, George. Now, it's Mark's turn to present, and he's going to tell us a bit about what climate science tells us about threats towards food production.
Okay, can you hear me? Now, so this, yes. I'm just going to share the screen I've got here, because this is the two books that I've written. The first one's called 6 Degrees, and the second one's also called 6 Degrees because that's a sequel. And the first one, which is the one on the left, I wrote back in 2007. The second one I've just finished, and it's just publishing in next month in 2020. So basically what I did for each of these books was to bring together hundreds, literally probably 1,000 or so climate science papers to look at the degree by degree impacts of climate warming. And I'm going to talk a bit about the agriculture and food side of things, since that's the topic today. And what I really noticed was that really only a couple of years ago, the consensus in the IPCC was that sort of a moderate warming of 2 or even 3 degrees would be broadly beneficial, really, for global agriculture. They thought that food would increase with a certain amount, a moderate amount of global warming. I have to say now, with the latest science, this looks dangerously naive. We're already seeing negative productivity trends across many of the world's major food crops due to climate heating. And in fact, this has already meant that 1.6 million tons of rice has been lost, 5 million tons of wheat. And this is just in today's world, which is 1 degree hotter than pre-industrial times. If we then see 2 degrees, we'll see a reduction of per capita food availability, the model's estimate of about 100 calories per day per person. This would lead to something like 500,000 additional deaths from malnutrition. So we're talking about substantial death tolls, and these are just in the very, very general models. And also, I think actually this is a big underestimate probably, because these models don't factor in the extreme heat, which means that the thermal tolerance thresholds of some of the major food crops around the world in the key food producing regions do get crossed even just in the 2 degrees world. So in the US Corn Belt, for example, the projections are that 100 million tons, which is pretty much most of the world's trade in maize and corn, will be lost just at 2 degrees. Now, most of the models don't take these critical temperature thresholds into account. They just assume that harvest losses are linear, and the projections are still quite worrying. It's about 6% per degree for wheat, 3% per degree for rice, and so on. And even if these linear projections were to come about, it doesn't sound, maybe it doesn't sound like a huge deal, but we've got a population which is going to be, by mid-century, 9.5 or 10 billion people. So as George mentioned earlier, I think this is potentially a return to structural famine, almost like the Middle Ages, because we simply would have the food production globally would not be able to match the demands of the population. And this, by the way, is in pretty much the best case scenario of 2 degrees of global heating. Now, this means, of course, and George is going to talk more about this, that we can't continue with farming as usual in an era of climate crisis. We could probably buy ourselves a couple of decades with crops with additional genes which can deal with drought and heat tolerance, but more in the longer term, something much more fundamental has to change. Of course, we have to deal with the climate problem so that we don't get to even 2 degrees, hopefully. But if we are heading in that direction, we have to learn to produce food in a very different way altogether. If you look at 3 degrees and above, then the situation gets even more critical. Really, the problem is just the sheer heat. It's going to be too hot for people to work outside for most of the daytime across the tropics and the subtropics. And that really means the end of subsistence farming that we know today in Africa and South Asia. Doesn't matter really what type of farming they are, whether it's organic or conventional or anything else, it's simply too hot physically to be able to work outside in the fields during the daytime. And then you've got drought. So the Sahara Desert spreading north and south, much of Africa in the extreme dryness zone, and many of the heartlands of the continent, so these are the main areas that are today's breadbaskets, would be classed as dry lands. So they're mostly non-viable for food production. Now, today's human population is overwhelmingly dependent on just 4 staple crops. These are wheat, maize, corn, actually 5, and because we include soybeans and rice as well. So all of these will have peaked and be in major decline in 3 degrees. And so we're looking at all of the major breadbaskets of today's food production systems, which is the US Corn Belt, the Central Plains, Eastern Europe, Russia, Brazil, China, South Asia. These are all the areas where you see the most rapidly rising temperatures and where you see the most extreme and most damaging heat impacts. And even in the far north, so even say in Canada, the projections are to see harvest declines due to these extreme heat conditions once temperatures even pass 2.5 degrees. So, as we were saying earlier, I know that obviously we're in an emergency situation, a crisis now with coronavirus, but imagine a situation where food production is cut by half with 2 billion more people demanding to be fed. And I have to say, we talk sometimes, those of us who are involved in climate change, about what the scenarios are that could lead to a kind of a collapse in civilization. I think obviously food production, the loss of food would be the most likely one. And I'm talking about 3 degrees here, which is basically where current government policies around the world take us. So, as we look today, what governments are doing, this takes us into a world with structural famine and without sufficient food. And if we see increasing emissions and we're heading towards 4 or even 5 degrees, this becomes even more lethal. specifically at 4 degrees, large areas of the world become biologically uninhabitable for humans. So the heat is actually lethal to us, again, physically. This is Middle East, South Asia, parts of China, and of course, you know, it goes more or less without saying that you can't produce food, you can't produce crops in such a situation as well. In the southern United States, the conditions would be more or less like what Death Valley is today. So, you know, really blistering heat and extremely dry conditions. And there's a paper, quite a well-known paper now, which was published in PNAS journal, which projects what the authors call synchronous harvest failures. So these are failures of harvests across all of the major bread baskets of the world at 4 degrees, probably somewhat earlier. And this is something which has never happened in the modern world. You might get a harvest in one place, but that can then be supplemented by trade from another. So maybe you could, you know, you might say, well, let's try and move food production away from the hot places and move to the cooler places and more towards the poles. But, you know, you'd have to go about 1,200 kilometers towards the North Pole to find conditions which are temperate, approximating what we have today. So you'd be plowing up thawed permafrost and boreal forest and tundra to plant wheat, which, even if it worked and there's very little soil in these places, is hardly a very smart idea. And if we go on up the scale, and I detail this a lot more in the book, but, you know, if we go to 5 degrees or so, it's a situation where humanity is essentially confined to refuges in places like Alaska or even the Antarctic Peninsula or something. I mean, it gets very speculative. At 6 degrees, I think we potentially are looking at the extinction of the human race and much of the rest of life on Earth as well. So it's important to remember this, you know, I'm not a doomster. I don't believe that we have to see these temperature rises. It's, you know, a sort of imaginary exercise now. If we were to keep the global economy from restarting all the fossil fuel production that we've now lost due to the COVID-19 epidemic, we'd still come in under 1.5 degrees. So it's not that these targets are out of reach, it's really the choices that we make as nations, as governments, and as an international community about how much fossil fuel we go and burn in decades to come. If we do restart the fossil fuel economy, then 2 degrees is looking even more out of reach. So, you know, like George, this is why I do talk about being, you know, a climate emergency situation. So, thanks for that. I'll hand back to you now to, you know, talk more about how we can avoid this and what we can do with them to keep people fed. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. That was a really interesting talk. And as Mark was saying, we've cut down a lot of fossil fuel production due to COVID-19. If we are to stay under our targets, then we have to not bail out corporations and allow them to come back and produce more emissions. Now, Dr. Emma will be talking about the way she farms, her ideas and assessment of the situation in sub-Saharan Africa, some hands-on experience from how agriculture can be more sustainable. On to you, Emma.
Thank you, Kate. Of course, climate change is a big issue here, everywhere in the world, and this is how I farm. First of all, a kilogram of soil is very important to me. Even a centimeter of land is very important. So we on my farm, we call it 1 acre unlimited, and we believe that it's not how much land you have, but how you utilize the piece of land you have, and we use science to do this. And my farm is integrated. It's just on 1 acre. And in this 1 acre, I divided it into 4 quarters. And in the first quarter, I keep pigs. In the second quarter, I grow matoke or plantain. And in the third quarter, I keep fish. And in the fourth quarter, I have vegetables. I also, on the part of the quarter, I also have cattle. So this is what happens to these quarters. First of all, the first quarter for the pigs is my cash cow, where I get feed the pigs on corn, soy, and all a well-mixed ration of food. And then when I feed it, when I feed them, what comes out, I just play with the dung. I just play with the waste from the pig. So when I get the waste from the pig dung, I take it to another, I would call it my factory. I call it my maggot factory, where I manufacture worms. I play with the life cycle of the housefly, where when we leave the pig dung out for some time, for a day or two per day, and then flies come and lay eggs on it. And when they lay eggs on the pig dung, we later get it out and cover it. And when we cover it at about maggots or these worms, we feed them the larvae stage of the housefly. We feed them to the chickens. So we feed them to the chickens and the fish. So, and then we also introduce earthworms in the pig dung. When we introduce earthworms in the pig dung, these earthworms degrade the dung, and then they turn it into soil. So it later turns into soil, and when it turns into soil, this soil is what I use to grow vegetables. And then the water that comes from the fish, I use it to irrigate the vegetables and my planting. And then I also irrigate corn. This corn I give to the cattle. So it's a life cycle, like one thing leads to another. So it's integrated, that everything feeds onto the other. And that's how I've been able to manage in this very tiny space. I've been able to make a living out of it. I've been able to feed my family, and I've been able actually to feed the community, to feed the school, because we opened up a school as well. So the school is fed on this 1 acre, where we give them the chicken, all that is protein. They'll eat eggs, they'll take milk, and then they will also have carbohydrate from the other food. So that's how my farm runs. And then, of course, we harvest as much water as possible. On our farm, nothing goes to waste. We make sure that everything we use, or everything we get, waste that we get from one place, we use it in the other. We've also introduced snails. So these snakes, or that also we use, like if especially we can feed them on some of the vegetables, or we can feed them on the shells, like from the chicken, the shells from the eggs. So when the children feed on the eggs from the chicken, then we pick the shells and still feed the shells to the slugs. And these slugs will later do something else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was really interesting, and I think a lot of people learned a lot about how circular farming works. So I think we're going to start rounding this up, and George, I think you're going to talk a bit about some possible ways forward now.
Thank you, Isabel. Yes, well, I mean, we've heard some very frightening scenarios there from Mark. We've heard some really inspiring potential solutions from Emma. We're going to have to look hard at every single aspect of food production and provide the food which will get us through this century and subsequent centuries. And this is a massive challenge. I'm pretty well devoting my life to it now for the next couple of years. I'm researching a book, trying to work out how we're going to do this. And I have to say that there aren't any easy answers. It would be lovely to say the way we're going to do many parts of the world where that simply won't be possible anymore because of the degree of heat that we are quite likely to face, and because of all these interconnected climate impacts coming together. Obviously, you know, our real hope is that we create the revolution required to prevent climate breakdown from happening in the first place, and we stop emissions from rising beyond beyond the point at which they cause more than 1.5 degrees of global heating. But we need the insurance policy as well in case we fail, because let's face it, I'm afraid at the moment we have quite a high likelihood of failure there. And so we have to start asking some really big and disturbing questions like, will our food be coming from different means of food production? And because of that, because of this, the scale of this challenge we face, I've become particularly interested in the possibilities of producing mycot. The Finnish laboratory, which seems to be the market leader at the moment in trying to develop this, and they're able to turn out at lab scale, in other words, a few kilograms a week of flour, which is basically soil bacteria, which have been fed on carbon dioxide and water, and hydrogen, which is the energy source. I was the first person outside the lab to eat a pancake made of that protein, and it tasted just like a pancake. It seems this is potentially highly scalable. It has potentially a very low environmental footprint, much lower than most food production. So it's one of the possibilities that I'm going to be exploring and that we should all be thinking about. And I know it sounds drastic, and for a lot of people it would sound frightening and a bit crazy, but that's the sort of way in which we're going to have to start thinking. There can't be sacred cows and holy lambs anymore. We have to say what is going to be essential for human survival, and let's go with that. And talking of sacred cows and holy lambs, it does seem that the most effective intervention we can make right now in terms of reducing the climate and ecological impacts of our diet is to switch away from a meat-based diet and move towards a largely plant-based diet. That's something we can start doing immediately, and many people, particularly young people around the world, are doing so. I would love to see those efforts expanded at the same time as we start to ask some really hard questions about where our food is going to come from. So watch this space. I'll be doing a lot more work on this over the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And thank you to Emma and Mark for giving amazing talks earlier. We're now going to move on to some questions. And the first question we've got here is a question to Emma. Emma, how can we get around the deforestation for agricultural purposes problem and still produce enough food?
Now, what happens is that's a big challenge. But like, let me talk for the tropics right now. This is what happens is that this is what we could do, or this is actually what is happening here. We plant crops that make sure that what is it called? We plant crops that coexist. Take for example, you plant banana. Plantation is still a tree, but it's not as it's not a big tree like coffee. You get what I'm saying? So we plant, they coexist. Then you're planting bananas alone. They coexist, and you plant them at the same time, at different times, but in the same space, where the coffee for the coffee, and then later when coffee grows, the banana plantation also grows. So they are coexisting to use to drink, and then this is also someone makes money. So that's how we could deal with the deforestation. And then we are also planting like different trees. We are encouraging people to plant the fruit trees. So it's a food, it's a tree, but at the same time, someone is creating a forest at the same time. So you find like here we're advocating for people to plant mangoes, to plant avocado, to plant jackfruit. So all this is food, but at the same time, to plant or food crops we are going to start growing, or people are growing, or to plant, there's a tree called macadamia. It's really a big tree. It produces very good nut for chocolate and all that, but at the same time, it's a tree. So it's helping in terms of putting back the forest or the trees that would have been cut earlier by the farmers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. So George, I've got a bit of a big question for you here. What is the government's role to ensure a just transition to a sustainable food system? And how can we make sure that the people whose livelihoods depend on farming, such as farming communities, are protected in the shift towards a more sustainable food system?
Thank you very much. Well, this is a crucial question. And again, the answers might not be easy ones. You know, we are really up against it here. We've left it so late in tackling these huge existential issues that we're going to see crash programs needed where previously we could have had gradual ones. So it really depends on the extent to which we can pull ourselves out of this death spiral. If we can stop massive greenhouse gas emissions and hold global heating to no more than 1.5 degrees, then in most parts of the world which currently produce food, farming can continue, though it needs to be, I think, very different to how it is generally practiced. It needs to be more along the model that Emma is talking about, and less along the model of ripping groundwater out of the ground as quickly as possible, depleting the soil, exposing the soil to very heavy rains and to loads of tractor movements, massive amounts of livestock moving across areas which could otherwise be growing forest. We need to see a very different farming system, even if we can maintain a habitable planet, because that very different system is essential for maintaining that habitable planet. And so that is going to mean that farmers are either subsidized to do something completely different, and let's face it, in many parts of the world, including in Europe and North America, farming largely depends upon subsidies rather than upon the market price that they get from crops and from livestock products. So we can either subsidize people to do something completely different, totally different farming practices, or in some places, getting out of farming altogether and doing something different like rewilding. Or we say, actually, you know, here is a situation where this land is no longer going to be farmable. So we're going to have to find a just transition away from land-based, making a land-based living for the reasons that Mark is talking about. You know, if we don't manage to hold it down to 1.5 degrees, if we go to 2 or 2.5 or even worse, then there's going to be huge areas of the land which will not be farmable anymore. And so, you know, we really need a just transition, not just for the land workers, which is obviously essential, but for the planet as a whole. That's going to be crucial. In the meantime, you know, we must help livestock farmers to get out of livestock. You know, not all livestock farming. I mean, the sort of stuff that Emma's doing, which is very integrated and is absolutely essential for the survival of people in Uganda and elsewhere. We're not talking about that, but I am talking about large-scale livestock ranching, where it's just a sort of monocrop of livestock. I'm talking about massive intensive livestock farming, which is breeding devastating diseases as well as causing huge environmental impacts. There we do need rapidly to see a just transition for people out of those sectors and into doing something different.
Thanks, George. That was a really interesting answer to that very important question. Now, our next question is to Mark. How much is animal agriculture contributing? Is it even possible to have sustainable meat and dairy production at today's scale?
Actually, just to follow on from what George was saying, the future pandemics might well come from animal production. You know, swine flu, bird flu have already been huge issues. Fortunately, they didn't get human-to-human transmission to anything like the extent that you'd need for a pandemic. And in fact, COVID-19 and SARS and MERS have come from animals directly to humans and then transmitted within humans, which is why they became such a danger. It looks like that this coronavirus came from a wet livestock market, so-called in China, where you've got wildlife being slaughtered or kept in really terrible conditions, very close, all mixed in together, then passing on to humans. These are the ideal breeding grounds for new viruses, which is why both SARS and the latest coronavirus have come from that kind of situation. It looks like Ebola and HIV, in fact, probably came from bushmeat in Central Africa. So everywhere you've got wild animals being exploited for meat by humans, you've also got these really substantial concerns, not just of pandemics, which can kill millions of people, but the depletion and potential extinction of the wildlife as well. So let's not pretend that kind of going back to depending off the wild is an alternative here. So if we can't produce livestock industrially and do that in a sustainable way, and we can't go hunter-gathering, then really the option is to move much more to plant-based diets. And I think, as George mentioned, it's really the only way efficiently to feed the growing population. You could feed 9.5, 10 billion people on today's agricultural production if you dramatically reduce meat and dairy. There's no doubt about that, because of the efficiencies. And the big challenge that we've got is to kind of separate food from land, if you like, because land is such an important factor. People haven't really ever taken this into account before. We're quite conditioned to think about carbon and energy, but land is absolutely critical for all biodiversity, and also, of course, for the carbon cycle. If every time you're ploughing up a new field or destroying a forest to produce more food in a farm, not only are you releasing a lot more carbon, but there's none then being sequestered by what would have been, a terrestrial ecosystem. So I think, what George was saying earlier, and what a lot of people are now working on, is how can we begin to really take land into consideration as a really, crucial limited factor of production. It's not just there for us to use as much of it as we want. And yes, we will need to dramatically reduce the use of animals in agriculture to achieve that.
Thank you, Mark. I think that answered a lot of questions that people are having surrounding animal agriculture, but also the current situation with the coronavirus. So Emma, how is your connection doing? Because we've got another question for you.
Good. I'm still good.
Great.
Good.
Amazing. So what are the biggest threats you are facing to your production? Is climate change having an impact in your community? Do you have any examples you'd like to share with us?
Oh yeah. Right now we're having an issue with we're having a very big issue with climate change right now, because we had 2 seasons where we thought January to March there's rains, and then there's a dry season, and then in August there are more rains. But sometimes what is happening right now is it can rain like from January to Feb, and then you have a very long spell of the dry season for maybe 8 months for 1 year. And then the next year you have about 6 months of rain. And then, so we're not so sure what to do, but we just keep growing and plowing, thinking that, okay, if it's not so obvious that we have the same seasons we used to have all the time, like a long time ago, that you very sure that, I'm talking, it has been raining for the last 2 weeks and people are out there plowing, and then out of the blue the sun has come out and there's no single rain, and yet we've plowed and grown, all put seed into the soil. So we're just hoping and praying that it rains soon, otherwise they're going to have issues, especially for people who don't have enough water with them, or their seed will go to waste, and then that later cause hunger or starvation because there's not enough food for people to eat.
Thanks, Emma.
Hello?
Oh.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Emma, for that really interesting answer to a very important question. Now, our next question is to George, and it's quite an interesting question because some people do advocate individual change as a solution, and that's not something the Fridays for Future does, but it's a very important question nonetheless. What are some things we can do as individuals? Does it make a difference in what we do in our everyday lives, or do we need to go bigger?
Thank you very much. Well, broadly, what we're facing here are structural problems. We're facing problems with the way the economy is structured, problems with the way the way that politics is structured. And one of the great efforts of politicians over the past 40 or 50 years has been to blame individuals for these structural failings. So you don't have a job. Well, never mind the fact that there's structural unemployment, it's your fault for not being enterprising enough. You don't have any money, never mind massive inequality, it's your fault for not being hardworking enough. You want to solve the environmental crisis, well, recycle your plastic bottles. And so we constantly are told to pursue micro solutions to macro problems. And on the whole, we need macro solutions to macro problems. We need system change, not climate change. However, there are one or two things which have such an impact on the living world that we do individually, that it is highly appropriate for us to focus on those as well. And the two things which any one of us is likely to do, which has the biggest impact, is one, flying, and two, diet. That if you're in a country like mine, the UK, you take a transatlantic flight, that is equivalent, more or less, to most of your carbon footprint for the whole year. And your diet is absolutely crucial. You know, if you've got a largely plant-based diet, the environmental impacts of it will be much, much lower than those of a largely meat-based diet. So while we should never stop fighting for structural change, and this is why the Fridays for Future movement and the Extinction Rebellion movement are so crucial, because both movements are pushing for structural change, at the same time we must do everything possible we can to minimize our own footprints, and that should start with flying and diet. Obviously it doesn't stop there, we try to do everything else as well, but those are the two big issues.
Thank you, George. I know that diet is something that a lot of people are incredibly interested in and want to know a lot about within the climate movement. So I think clearing it up is very good. So our next question has come in, and it is for Mark. And how concerned are you that we won't be able to feed everyone? What are the biggest threats? For example, more extreme weather, such as droughts, erosion, and such as erosion of fertile soil and desert spreading, water shortages, and nitrogen, etc. What do you think is the most dangerous?
Okay, thanks for that. So about 10 years ago, I wrote a book about planetary boundaries called The God Species, actually, and that was looking at the kind of critical Earth system boundaries, of which climate is one, but you mentioned nitrogen, that's another one, biodiversity, even ozone layer, water, land. So when you look at the Earth as a system, as a living organism, if you like, all of those factors you need to take into consideration. And when we talk about climate change, now we're also beginning to bring land into the debate. If you talk about farming, you've got to bring nitrogen into it. Then we talk about biodiversity as well. We're talking about water. So in many ways, the farming issue, agriculture issue, food production issue encompasses pretty much all of the planetary boundaries, maybe with the exception of the ozone layer and one or two other things, but it's far more all-encompassing than any other environmental challenge that we face. So I think that's the kind of the background to this, which is why it seems so difficult, because it's one thing to solve a single problem, but how do you solve an entire system where you've got all these interlocking problems which are really so complex that even these integrated computer models running on supercomputers and doing, you know, trillions of calculations a second come up with wildly varying sort of projections of, you know, how things are going to be in the future, or even how things are now. So I think we have to kind of focus back on the simple stuff, right? We know what diet is more sustainable in terms of the general population, right? We know that's more plant-based. We know we've got to try and produce more food for less land. We know why that's important. We've got to use less, not just less carbon, but we've got to go net zero and completely eliminate fossil fuel use by mid-century if we want 2 degrees, or earlier if we want 1.5. So actually these things are quite simple, and the big challenges now are how we can continue to feed a growing population, because we're not going to do anything about the population. We don't want to kill people. You know, we do want younger kids who are primarily, you know, based in developing countries, who are the new population who are coming up, to be adequately fed. Let's not get Malthusian about this. So we do want people to be fed, and how can we do that at the same time as solving the climate crisis?
Now, our next question is this is probably something that might be good for George, I think. How can we make the global distribution of food more equal? For example, in the West, we throw away a lot of food, and in the global South, there's a much higher rate of hunger and starvation.
Well, the first thing to say is that at the moment we have a global food surplus, but hundreds of millions of people go hungry. And they go hungry because of the maldistribution of wealth and power. It's not because there isn't enough food. It's because people don't have enough purchasing power, because some people are so poor and they're being kept so poor by the structure of the global economic system. And also, in many parts of the world, people don't have the democratic voice required to ensure that their needs are met. So again, this really comes down to system change. You know, it's all very well supplying food aid and looking at the sort of micro level of what food is going to where. That's necessary. Food aid, unfortunately, remains necessary. It would be a really great thing if it didn't. But it should be in the form of stimulating local producers rather than shipping US grain all over the world, as unfortunately the US government tends to do, because most US food aid is for the benefit of its own farmers, not for the benefit of the recipients. But the crucial thing is to have much fairer economic systems and much more democratic political systems, so that everybody's needs are met. And we see this across a whole load of issues. I mean, here in the UK, in every city, there are people lying in shop doorways in sleeping bags, where we know that many people in that city have 2 homes, 3 homes, even 4 homes. It's grotesque, it's outrageous. This has become the normal that we've become accustomed to. And one of the things I'm really hoping that this pandemic will do is to show us that's not the normal we want to get back to. Our normal has shifted massively with the pandemic. Let's not shift back to the cruel and destructive and horrendous normal which we had been lulled into before. So there has to be a much better distribution of wealth and power, and that leads automatically to a better distribution of food.
Thank you, George. I think that's that's a very, very big issue. Something that you mentioned was that a lot of times it's the farmers that are wanting to make lots of money. But say a farmer wants to make a difference, but cannot at this time change their system of farming too much. Emma, do you have any examples for what they can do as a first few steps towards protecting, say, local biodiversity and just trying to improve their climate footprint? Emma, are you with us? Unfortunately, Emma's connection seems to not be here right now, so I think we can return to this question a little bit later if her connection has returned. Let's see. Let's go on and give Mark a question, and we will take what will climate change actually mean for agriculture? And wait, we already did that one. Sorry.
Emma, are you back now?
Yeah.
I've been off, so yeah,
Oh,
I'm back.
great.
Yeah.
You missed a question, but Isabel repeated. Yeah.
Yeah, I will. Great. So George just talked about how farmers are the ones that, or people owning big farms at least, are the ones that are earning a lot from the climate and how they are doing with this system. So, but if a farmer wants to make a difference but can't change the system of farming at the moment, maybe due to cost or due to being stuck in contracts, what are the first few steps towards protecting local biodiversity and lessening their climate footprint without too much?
That's to me?
Yeah, I think since you have managed so well to adapt your farm, do you have any tips to give to others?
Yeah, ideally, this is what people should do. I'll tell you my story. So I come to this village. That's how you understand it. So I come to this village where it's a fishing village, as in everyone depends on the lake, and so they fish a lot. But then it's so dry, and everything is like it's rocky. So you wouldn't imagine it's red. So you wouldn't imagine that you could do anything with the land. And actually, when we planted our first plantain or banana, the people in the same village laughed at us and said, "Oh no, nothing can grow here because that's what they have. The place is rocky, so food here, like the type of food we're growing, doesn't grow." And then I have this science at the back of my mind. I know that, oh, if I put some manure, if I feed this soil better, I give it water and I give it the nutrients it needs, I'll be able to produce whatever I want from the soil. So I used the science I had that I'd gotten from school, and then I grew some matoke, and everyone was like, no, it can't be. Everyone, actually, the people who had earlier laughed came. And what we did, that whenever I grew something and it became a success, I called the people in the village and told them, you see, we could do this. You see, this is possible. And I went on to train first from the people in the village, my neighbors, my immediate neighbors, that, oh, I could do this, and then I grow. And actually, when we came the time, the staple food then was, actually it was not staple food. They always bought food or corn, what we call posho. They bought corn from another village to come and eat, and they use it with their fish. But right now, then in the process, they overfished, or they did bad fishing in the fish, in the lake, and then there's no more fish right now. And I said to myself, okay, fine, I can't even compete. I don't know how to fish, number one. I can't use a rod, or I can't use a boat to go to the lake. And then I have this science at the back of my mind again. And like, if I know if a fish need water and they need some warmth, so I can create something simple for them to actually stay in my same environment, and I grow the fish. So that's how I went on and decided to grow all these simple things on my farm, the fish, the hydroponics, the aquaponics, just a few things, simple things. So what am I trying to say? With science, I was lucky that I'm a scientist and I knew what to do. But even these other smallholder farmers or some farmers can use these scientists, can go and visit, can read about all these things, and they do something simple. But it all comes from right now, what can we do at the moment? The same thing, even like you see when this coronavirus came on, and they said everyone is dying, and the first thing people were told to self-isolate. I thank George has told us he has been self-isolated for the last 57 days. I've only done 14 yet, because that's what the government told us to do. So if you look at your situation at that particular time and say, what can I do first of all, save myself and to save the community around me. And then we use either science or neighbors, all the books we read around, and then you can do something better, something that can help you in person, and also then later help the community, which will later help the world. So it's very important to first sit down and say, what do I need as a person? And then after you found out exactly what you need yourself to do, you go ahead and do it using the different medias you have. You can use internet, you can use neighbors, you can use friends, you can use books, you can use anything that is available. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I'm sure that's going to be very helpful if people are listening or interested in trying to become more sustainable farmers. Now, our final question is quite a good one to finish on, actually. How long do you think that we can continue as we are today before we see a drop in the amount of food we can actually produce and feed people with? Pretty much, what's the time scale we have to move to more sustainable systems? And as the last question, I'm going to ask all three speakers to give an answer to this. And Mark, would you like to go first?
Sure. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we're already seeing a drop-off in productivity of key crops due to extreme heat and drought in some of the major food producing areas. It's also particularly hitting smallholder farmers. Emma shared with us some of the impacts of more erratic weather patterns that are being seen in the tropics, and particularly where she's talking to us from in Uganda. You hear those kinds of anecdotal stories from all around the world, and they're matched by the scientific data, which shows that you're seeing an intensification of the hydrological cycle. So you get heavier rainfall, then you get worse droughts. So you can get floods and droughts in a cycle. This is not ideal for producing food. So this is already hitting production today. I think that's important to understand. And this is just with 1 degree. Now 1.5, we'll see accelerating impacts. So even though we talk about this as a target we have to aim for, remember this is a worse world than we're in now. And we're going to see big challenges in terms of how we can keep the amount of food that we need, and start looking at some of the options that George is talking about, as well as, you know, in terms of separating food production from the land, certainly in terms of the industrial model, and in terms of how we can change people's diets as well. Looking to 2 degrees, 3 degrees and up, you know, that's when I think we are returning to structural famine. This civilization will not survive a situation where you cannot feed, you know, a substantial portion of the world's population. You know, people don't just sit at home and starve to death. They will flee in large numbers, in millions, as climate refugees across borders, desperately seeking for sustenance. So we have to do everything we can, both to mitigate climate change and not get into the world above 2 degrees and above, at the same time as trying to figure out ways to produce the food that we need to feed people in the meantime.
Thank you, Mark. Now I'm going to go to Emma, who was speaking earlier about how she's already seeing effects on her farm in Uganda. But how long do you think we can continue like we are today before we see like significant drops across many places in the world of the food we can actually produce and feed people with?
I think we've already, like I said, let's try to make as much as possible to mitigate all these as much as possible, because it could be tomorrow. It could be you just know, did we even ever know that all of us will be at one time, this time in the world, the whole world will be locked up. So it can just happen anytime, today, tomorrow, the other day. So we just have to be ready to, or let's do what we think we can in our best way possible to mitigate the climate change. So we grow more trees, especially now in the tropics. grow as many. Actually, there's a policy here before 5. So before you cut one, you should have already planted so many. So these are some of the policies that they need to be done, so that at least even when you really need to cut a tree, or you need to use something that is going to destroy the world or the climate, there are other better things you've put up in place to mitigate it. So it could be any time, really. It could be any time. Just like coronavirus came and we didn't know that would be self-isolated at this time T.
Thank you, Emma. Now on to George. Same question.
So those of us in the rich world have become totally accustomed to the idea that food is just going to be there. And that's because we've got these global trade networks which ensure that we can draw food from all over the world, often at other people's expense. I mean, we're often taking food, snatching food from the mouths of the poor in order to feed ourselves, because land which should be used by local people to provide for themselves is instead being grabbed and is being used to produce luxury items being sold in rich countries. And because we've got a system which for the rich is resilient at the moment, in that we can draw from lots of parts of the world, so if there's a harvest failure in one place, it doesn't matter to us because we can buy food from somewhere else. We've become completely accustomed to the idea of perpetual abundance. So it's almost unimaginable to us to picture what the world would look like if that perpetual abundance stops. In other words, if we have structural famine, we have less actual food on Earth than the people required to be fed. And so one thing we have to do is to make that imaginative leap. And if we are facing what Mark is talking about, which is synchronous global harvest failures above, say, 2.5 or 3 degrees of global heating, then that's what we're looking at. We're looking at potentially very sudden structural famine. And we are now to pull out all the stops to prevent that from happening. That is the #1 urgent task facing humanity. We've had a small taste with this pandemic of what it's like for supply lines to be disrupted, where for the first time in some people's lives, we're seeing empty supermarket shelves. And it's quite alarming, isn't it? But at the back of our minds, we know that those will be refilled. In a few weeks, there'll be more food to put on those shelves. And so, okay, we'll suffer some temporary disruption. We might not be able to eat our favorite food. We'll have to eat something else instead, but it'll be sorted out. But we have no such long-term confidence, because if the shelves empty as a result of structural famine, they are not going to be refilled and we are going to starve. And it's imagining that other world, it's picturing ourselves in that place, which is in many ways the key task. It's an imaginative failure which has allowed climate breakdown to start happening. And it's got to be a recharging of the imagination which is going to stop it. And through Fridays for Future, through Extinction Rebellion, the other wonderful movements which are kicking off around the world, we must recharge our imaginations, see what it is we face, and move very fast indeed to stop it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, and thank you to Dr. Emma and Mark Lynas for joining us today. We've had a really interesting webinar, I think, on the topic of agriculture and the climate crisis. And each of you has brought your own take on it and from your own experiences. I hope all our viewers who are watching right now have made it here okay after our YouTube stream broke. But I'm sure this video will go up on YouTube later after we've edited it and downloaded it, so you will be able to view it on YouTube later, and people who want to watch it back can do it then. Next week, we haven't decided on a topic yet, but there'll be another webinar at the same time with new guests, and that will be going out on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Thank you for watching, and an even bigger thank you to George Monbiot, Mark Lynas, and Dr. Emma for joining us today. Your hosts were Kay and Isabel. and we're going to be leaving you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.